Okay, welcome to the third of Derek Parfit's 3 Tanner lectures. Today's the day the rabbit gets pulled out of the hat. You're all invited back tomorrow at this time to discuss how it happened. Derek Parfit lecturing on contractualism.
Contractualists ask us to imagine that we are all trying to reach agreement on which moral principles we shall all accept. According to what we can call the rational agreement formula, we ought to act on the principles to whose acceptance it would be rational for everyone to agree. I shall say that people choose the principles to whose acceptance they agree. People choose rationally, most contractualists assume, if their choice would be likely to be best for themselves. And we can start by making that assumption. Though there are some principles whose acceptance would be likely to be best for everyone, there are others whose acceptance would be best only for certain people. What would be best for the rich, for example, would not be best for the poor. It may seem that in such cases there would be no principle whose choice would be rational for everyone in self-interested terms. But everyone would know that everyone would accept only the principles that everyone chose. So what each person ought rationally to choose would depend on what others were likely to choose. There would be no point in our choosing the principles whose acceptance would be best for ourselves if these principles would not be chosen by everyone else. What we ought rationally to choose would also depend on the effects of our failing to reach agreement. Most contractualists tell us to suppose that if we fail to agree, no one would accept any moral principles, so no one would believe that any acts were wrong. This no-agreement world would be likely to be bad for everyone. That would give everyone strong reasons to choose, to try to reach agreement. And it might be rational for everyone to choose not the principles whose acceptance would be best for themselves, but the principles which other people would be most likely to choose. That might be everyone's best hope of avoiding the horrors of the no-agreement world. Now, such reasoning is for some writers the essence of contractualism. On this view, we should regard morality as if it were a mutually advantageous bargain. When people's interests conflict, it would be rational for everyone to agree to certain principles to resolve these conflicts. And by appealing to that fact, these writers claim, we can justify these principles in the actual world in which there has been no such agreement. Now, to make the imagined agreement easier to achieve, we can suppose that there'd be discussions and a series of votes, but there would have to be some final vote. It must be true that if we failed to reach agreement in this last round, we'd have lost our chance and couldn't try again. In earlier rounds, it would be rational for us to try to reach agreement on terms that favored ourselves. Only in the decisive final vote would it be rational for us to make our full concessions to others. I mean, there's got to be a real danger of the no-agreement world, and that is created by having one final vote. Well, there is now a complication. The no-agreement world would be less bad for certain people, such as those who control more resources or have greater abilities. In a world without morality, such people would be better able to fend for themselves. These people would have less need to reach agreement, and that would give them greater bargaining power. They could declare that they would accept only principles that gave special advantages to them, and such warnings or threats might be credible, since these people would be more prepared to run the risk of no agreement. In some cases, moreover, it would be better for some people if there was no agreement. One example is the question of how much of their resources the rich ought to transfer to the poor. If there was no agreement on that question, so that no one accepted any principle about what the rich ought to give, that would be much the same as everyone's believing that the rich were permitted to give nothing, and that would be fine with the rich. For these and similar reasons, those who had greater bargaining power could win agreement on principles that gave special advantages to them, since it would be rational for others to give in to their threats. Well, some writers accept these implications of the rational agreement formula. These Hobbesian contractualists defend a minimal version of morality. On Gautier's view, for example, since morality presupposes mutual benefit, it would not be wrong for us to act in ways that injure or kill other people if it would have been no worse for us if these people had never existed. Gautier doesn't quite claim that, but that's the implication. Kantian contractualists, like Rawls, reject these implications. As Rawls writes, to each according to his threat advantage is not a principle of justice. But Rawls's version of contractualism is not, I believe, Kantian enough. In considering Rawls's view, we can start with his assumptions about rationality. Rawls accepts the deliberative theory, according to which we ought rationally to do whatever would best achieve what we most want after informed deliberation. As I've said, of those who accept this theory, many believe that it coincides with the self-interest theory, according to which we ought rationally to do whatever would be best for ourselves. These people mistakenly assume that after informed deliberation, each of us would always care most about our own well-being. Rawls does not make that assumption. He considers cases in which justice requires us to act in ways that would be very bad for ourselves. Even in such cases, Rawls claims it might be rational for us to do what justice requires. We would be acting rationally if we would be doing what, all things considered, we most wanted to do. In his words, if a person wants with deliberative rationality to act from the standpoint of justice above all else, it is rational for him so to act. Since the deliberative theory is desire-based, however, Rawls cannot claim that it would be rational for everyone to act justly. And when he discusses people who would benefit from injustice, Rawls claims that if these people don't care about morality, we couldn't honestly recommend justice as a virtue to them, since they would not have sufficient reasons to do what justice requires. On desire-based theories, we can't have reasons to want anything for its own sake. If people don't care about something, and wouldn't care even after informed deliberation, we cannot claim that they have reasons to care. As Rawls writes, knowing that people are rational, we do not know the ends they will pursue, only that they will pursue them intelligently. Similarly, when he rejects the view that something is right when an ideally rational and impartial spectator would approve it, Rawls comments, since this definition makes no specific psychological assumptions about the impartial spectator, it yields no principles to account for his approvals. Now, this comment assumes that we have no reasons to care about the well-being of others. If Rawls believed that we have such reasons, he wouldn't claim that if we knew only that someone was ideally rational, we could draw no conclusions about what this person would approve. Rawls's claim would instead be that since this person was ideally rational, he would approve what he had reasons to approve. For example, he would approve of acts that relieved suffering or saved people's lives. We can now turn to Rawls's suggested account of morality, which he calls rightness as fairness. As a contractualist, Rawls appeals to the principles that it would be rational for everyone to choose. On Rawls's desire-based theory, what it would be rational for people to choose depends on what they would want, and since Rawls cannot predict what everyone would want, he adds a motivational assumption. He tells us to suppose that when we were choosing moral principles, everyone's main aim would be to promote their own well-being. On this simplifying assumption, the deliberative and self-interest theories coincide. If we cared most about our own well-being, it would be deliberately rational for us to make the choices that we could expect to be best for ourselves. So, though Rawls rejects the self-interest theory, his motivational assumption allows him to appeal to claims about self-interested rationality. Rawls revises the rational agreement formula by adding a veil of ignorance. According to Rawls's formula, we ought to act on the principles that it would be rational for everyone to choose if we had to choose these principles without knowing anything about ourselves or our circumstances. And Rawls gives several reasons for this veil of ignorance. If we had full information, Rawls claims, we would often be unable to reach agreement. And if we knew nothing about ourselves, that would make us impartial. No one would know the facts that would give some people greater bargaining power. Nor could anyone choose principles that were biased in their own favor. Though we would be choosing principles for self-interested reasons, our ignorance of who we are would force us to take everyone's well-being into account. Rawls believes that his contractualism provides a systematic alternative to all forms of utilitarianism. And this belief is surprising. If we appeal to a combination of self-interested rationality and impartiality, it's hard to avoid utilitarian conclusions. Utilitarianism is, roughly, self-interested rationality plus impartiality. Rawls is aware of this problem. He compares two versions of his formula. On what we can call the equal chance formula, if we were behind Rawls's veil of ignorance, we should assume that we had an equal chance of being in anyone's position. Rawls says that on this assumption, it would be rational for us to choose a principle whose acceptance would make the average level of well-being as high as possible. By choosing this utilitarian average principle, we would maximize our own expected level of well-being. But Rawls rejects this equal chance formula. If we were behind the veil of ignorance, Rawls claims, we should not assume that we had an equal chance of being in anyone's position. On his preferred no-knowledge formula, we would have no knowledge of the probabilities. That would make it rational for us, Rawls argues, to choose certain non-utilitarian principles. For this argument to succeed, Rawls must defend his rejection of the equal chance formula. When describing his veil of ignorance, Rawls writes, "There seem to be no objective grounds for assuming that one has an equal chance of turning out to be anybody." This remark treats the veil of ignorance as if it would be some actual state of affairs whose nature we would have to accept. But Rawls is proposing a thought experiment whose details are up to him. He could tell us to suppose that we have an equal chance of being anyone. What is wrong with that assumption? Rawls himself points out that since there are different contractualist formulas, he must explain why we should appeal to his formula. This formula, he writes, must be the one that is philosophically most favored because it best expresses the conditions that are widely thought reasonable to impose on the choice of principles. Could Rawls claim that compared with the equal chance formula, his no-knowledge formula better expresses these conditions? The answer, I believe, is no. Rawls's veil of ignorance is intended to ensure that in choosing principles we would be impartial. To achieve this aim, Rawls need not tell us to suppose that we have no knowledge of the probabilities. If we supposed we had an equal chance of being in anyone's position, that would make us just as impartial. And since there's no other difference between the equal chance and no knowledge formulas, these formulas are equally plausible. Remember next that, as Rawls claims, the equal chance formula leads naturally to the utilitarian average principle. Since Rawls cannot justify his rejection of this formula, Rawls's contractualism does not, as he believes, provide an argument against utilitarianism. As Rawls points out, there's another ground on which we might justifiably reject some contractualist formula. We may be right to reject some formula, however plausible it seems, if this formula's implications conflict with some of our strongest moral beliefs. Since Rawls assumes that utilitarianism conflicts with such beliefs, he might claim that we can justifiably reject the equal chance formula on the ground that it leads to an unacceptable conclusion. If Rawls made this claim, however, his contractualism would still provide no argument against utilitarianism. Rawls would be appealing to our non-utilitarian beliefs to justify our rejecting the equal chance formula and appealing to his no-knowledge formula. So he couldn't also claim that by rejecting the equal chance formula and appealing to his formula, we could justify our non-utilitarian beliefs. If we defend some argument by appealing to certain beliefs, we can't then defend these beliefs by appealing to this argument. Rawls might retreat to the claim that though the equal chance formula supports utilitarianism, his no-knowledge formula supports acceptable non-utilitarian principles. Now, if that were true, Rawls's appeal to his formula would at least show that veil of ignorance contractualists don't have to accept utilitarian conclusions. When he appeals to his formula, Rawls argues that if we had no knowledge of the probabilities, we ought rationally to assume the worst and try to make our worst possible outcome as good as possible. We ought therefore to choose the principles whose acceptance would make the worst off people as well off as possible. Since this argument tells us to maximize the minimum level, we can call it the maximin argument. Now, this argument has been widely criticized. Even if it was sound, however, it wouldn't support an acceptable moral view. Suppose that we must choose how to use some scarce medical resources. In one of the two possible outcomes, Green would live to 25 and 1,000 other people would live to 80. In the other outcome, Green would live to 26 and these other people would live to 30. On the maximin argument, we ought to choose the second outcome, giving Green her extra year of life. That's the wrong conclusion. We can plausibly give some priority to benefiting those who are worse off, and Green is worse off by dying younger. But this priority should not be absolute. It would be wrong to give Green 1 extra year of life rather than giving 50 extra years to each of 1,000 other people who without these years would die almost as young as Green. Now, Rawls accepts what I've just claimed. Though he applies his maximin argument to the basic structure of society, Rawls agrees that when we consider other questions about distributive justice, this argument has implications that are unacceptably extreme. Rawls rejects utilitarian theories because they fail to provide an acceptable principle of distributive justice, but as Rawls admits, his version of contractualism fails to provide such a principle. Well, we can now look briefly at some other moral questions, such as whether and when it would be right to break promises or tell lies or impose certain risks on others. On Rawls's maximin argument, when we choose between different principles about such acts, we ought rationally to choose the principles whose acceptance would make the worst off people as well off as possible. There are here 3 objections to this argument. First, it's hard to apply. In the case of promises, for example, whom should we regard as the worst off people? Are they the people who would lose most from particular acts of breaking or keeping promises, or those who would benefit least from the practice of promising, or those who would be on the whole worst off, all things considered? Well, perhaps it's the last, but even if we could answer that question, this can't be the right way to choose between different principles. If one of two forms of the practice of promising would give much greater benefits to most people, that is not, as the Maximin argument implies, irrelevant. Third, this argument forces us to ignore most non-utilitarian considerations. According to utilitarians, when we are choosing between acts or principles, it's enough to know the size and number of the resulting benefits and burdens. Most of us believe that there are several other morally relevant considerations. These include questions about responsibility, desert, deception, coercion, fairness, gratitude, and autonomy. On Rawls's version of contractualism, such questions are irrelevant. Though Rawlsian moral reasoning differs from utilitarian reasoning, it differs only by subtraction. When Rawls describes how people would choose moral principles behind his veil of ignorance, he writes that they decide solely on the basis of what best seems calculated to further their interests, so far as they can ascertain them. Rawls merely denies these people most of the knowledge that self-interested calculations need. There's no way in which non-utilitarian considerations could possibly enter in. When he first presents his theory, Rawls writes, "It's perfectly possible that some form of the principle of utility would be adopted, and therefore that contract theory leads eventually to a deeper and more roundabout justification of utilitarianism." He also writes, "For the contract view, which is the traditional alternative to utilitarianism, such a conclusion would be a disaster." Rawls, I believe, could deny that his theory justifies utilitarianism. But his claim would have to be that though his theory leads to utilitarian conclusions, it's not plausible enough to support these conclusions. To reach a more successful version of contractualism, we should turn to a different formula and a different view about rationality and reasons. According to the rational agreement formula, we ought to act on the principles to whose acceptance it would be rational for everyone to agree. According to what I've called Kant's contractualist formula, we ought to act on the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. Now, these formulas both require unanimity, since they both appeal to the principles that everyone could rationally choose. But unlike the rational agreement formula, Kant's formula doesn't use the idea of an agreement. According to the agreement formula, more fully stated, we ought to act on the principles that it would be rational for everyone to choose if each person supposed that everyone would accept all and only the principles that everyone chose. According to Kant's formula, we ought to act on the principles that everyone could rationally choose if each person supposed that everyone would accept all and only the principles that she herself chose. So, in applying the agreement formula, we conduct a single thought experiment in which we imagine that we are all trying to reach agreement on which principles everyone would accept. But in applying Kant's formula, we conduct many thought experiments, one for each person. We imagine that each of us applies Kant's moral belief formula, one version of his formula of universal law, by asking which principles she could rationally choose if she had the power to choose or to will which principles everyone would accept. And Kant's contractualist formula just appeals to the principles, if there are any, which in these separate thought experiments everyone could rationally choose. So in that way, it's quite unlike ordinary versions of contractualism. Kant's formula, I believe, better achieves Rawls's aims. One of these aims is to eliminate inequalities in bargaining power. On Kant's formula, what it would be rational for each of us to choose doesn't depend on what other people would be likely to choose. Since there's no need to reach agreement, there's no scope for bargaining, so no one would have greater bargaining power. Consider next one of Rawls's reasons for rejecting utilitarianism. Justice, Rawls writes, does not allow that the sacrifices imposed on the few are outweighed by the larger sum of advantages enjoyed by the many. According to several Kantian contractualists, utilitarianism goes astray because of the way in which it adds together different people's benefits and burdens. Utilitarians believe that it would be right to impose great burdens on a few people whenever that would give a greater sum of benefits to others. According to these contractualists, to protect people from having such great burdens imposed on them, we should deny that the numbers count and should appeal instead to the idea of a unanimous agreement. By requiring unanimity, we can give everyone a veto against being made to bear such burdens. I call this contractualism's protective aim. Now, the rational agreement formula, as we've seen, fails to achieve that aim. Precisely by requiring a unanimous agreement, this formula gives greater power not to those who most need morality's protection, but to those who least need such protection, because their greater control of resources or other advantages give them greater bargaining power. Rawls's formula also fails to achieve this protective aim. Though Rawls's veil of ignorance eliminates bargaining power, it prevents anyone from knowing whether they are one of the people on whom utilitarian principles would impose such great burdens. And since Rawls appeals to the principles whose choice would be rational in self-interested terms, he cannot plausibly deny that we could rationally choose rule utilitarian principles, running the risks of bearing some burdens for the sake of possible benefits. Since Kant's formula neither requires an agreement nor has a veil of ignorance, it better achieves contractualism's protective aim. On this formula, we ought not to impose burdens on anyone unless our act is permitted by some principle that this person could rationally choose, even when she knows that she's one of the people who would bear such burdens. Kant's formula has other advantages. Though Rawls's veil of ignorance ensures impartiality, it does that crudely, like frontal lobotomy. The disagreements between different people are not resolved, but suppressed. Since no one knows anything about themselves, unanimity is guaranteed. In the thought experiments to which Kant's formula appeals, everyone knows how their interests conflict with the interests of others. Since unanimity isn't guaranteed, it would be significant if unanimity could be achieved. Well, whether unanimity could be achieved depends on what we ought to believe about rationality and reasons. If we ought to accept a desire-based theory or the self-interest theory, Kant's formula couldn't succeed. If each person supposed that she had the power to choose which principles we would all accept, there'd be no set of principles whose choice would be rational for everyone in self-interested terms, nor would there be some set of principles whose acceptance would best fulfill everyone's informed desires. We ought, I believe, to reject all desire-based theories, and though the self-interest theory is of the right kind in being value-based, this theory is too narrow. On the wide value-based view that I believe we should accept, we have strong reasons to care about our own well-being and in a temporally neutral way, but our own well-being is not the supremely rational ultimate aim. We can rationally care as much or more about some other things, such as justice and the well-being of others. If we combine Kant's formula with this view about reasons, does it succeed? Ought we to act on the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will? Well, I cannot here answer that question, but there are two other prior questions. are there such principles, ones that everyone could rationally choose? And if they are, what do they imply? For Kant's formula to succeed, what we can call its uniqueness condition must be sufficiently often met. It must be true that at least in most cases, there's some relevant principle, and only one such principle, that everyone could rationally choose. If there was either no such principle, or everyone could rationally choose two or more seriously conflicting principles, Kant's formula would have unacceptable implications, since it would either permit or condemn too many acts. It might not matter, though, if everyone could rationally choose any of several similar principles. Such principles might be different versions of some more general higher-level principle, and the choice between the lower-level ones could be made in some other way. Well, this formula's uniqueness condition is, I believe, often met. Consider first cases in which some quantity of unowned goods can be shared between different people. No one has any special claim to these goods, such as a claim based on their greater needs or their being worse off than others. And however these goods are distributed, the total sum of benefits would be the same. Now, most of us believe that in such cases, everyone should get equal shares. Kant's formula appeals to the principles that everyone could rationally choose if each person supposed that everyone would accept whatever principles she chose. We can argue, A, if everyone could rationally choose the principles that, in such cases, gives everyone equal shares. B, no one could rationally choose any principle that gave them less than equal shares. C, only the principle of equal shares gives no one less than equal shares. So D, that's the only principle that everyone could rationally choose. Now, if we accept the self-interest theory, we must deny that everyone could rationally choose the principle of equal shares. On this theory, everyone ought rationally to choose some principle that gave themselves more than equal shares. And we must also reject A if we accept a desire-based theory. There are many people whose informed desires would not be best fulfilled by their choosing the principle of equal shares. But I believe that, as A claims, everyone could rationally choose this principle. We wouldn't be rationally required to choose some principle that gave us more than equal shares. According to B, no one could rationally choose any principle that gave them less than equal shares. Well, we can notice a difference here between consenting to acts and choosing principles. We could, I think, sometimes rationally consent to being given a less than equal share so that some stranger would get a greater share. Such choices would be generous and fine. But that doesn't imply that we could rationally choose some principle that gave us less than equal shares. Such a principle would apply not only to us, but all the members of some group. One example would be a principle that gave smaller shares to women. If we are women, we couldn't rationally choose that principle. We'd have no reason to want all other women to get smaller shares, nor would that choice be generous and fine. Consider next act utilitarianism, or AU, according to which acts are right just in case they maximize the sum of benefits. In the cases we're now considering, the sum of benefits would be the same, whatever their distribution, so AU implies that it doesn't matter how we distribute these benefits. We could permissibly give some benefits, some people no benefits at all. Well, even the greatest act utilitarian rejected that conclusion. In such cases, Sidgwick writes, we ought to supplement AU with an egalitarian principle. If Sidgwick had applied Kant's formula, he would have admitted that no one could rationally choose AU, since no one could rationally choose any principles that permits them to be given less than equal shares. Well, note next that for this argument to succeed, that premise could be much weaker. It would be enough to claim that some people couldn't rationally choose to be given a principle that gave them less than equal shares. According to the argument's remaining premise, only the principle of equal shares gives no one less than equal shares. That's clearly true, so as the argument implies, Kant's formula implies that everyone should get such chairs. Now, in most cases, the sum of benefits depends in part on how goods are distributed between different people. I believe that in some of these cases, at least, Kant's formula can be used to defend other non-utilitarian distributive principles, but I have no time to discuss those cases here. Someone may again object, when we ask these questions about what people could rationally choose, our answers depend on our moral beliefs. You claim that in your example, some people couldn't rationally choose the act utilitarian principle. Act utilitarians would reject that claim since they believe that everyone could rationally choose to bear any burden, however great, for the sake of a greater sum of benefits to others. Since our answer to these questions depend on our moral beliefs, Kant's formula achieves nothing. Well, this objection, as I've said, seems to me mistaken. When we combine Kant's principles with our beliefs about rationality, we can reach conclusions which conflict with our moral beliefs, and we can't just readjust our beliefs about rationality. However, these two kinds of belief are, as this objection claims, closely related. And by considering these relations, we can reach some wider conclusions. Our beliefs about rationality and reasons may partly depend on our moral beliefs, since we have moral reasons for acting, and some of these reasons are provided by facts about what's right or wrong. This dependence can also go the other way. Our moral beliefs may partly depend on our beliefs about rationality and reasons. That can be true in two main ways. First, we may be contractualists, who believe that the rightness of acts depends on which of the principles that everyone could rationally choose. Second, our moral beliefs may partly depend on our beliefs about what is non-morally good or bad, and these beliefs may in turn depend on our beliefs about reasons. Well, that dependence is less obvious. Pain is bad, most of us believe, in the sense of being something that we have reason to avoid. But some great philosophers didn't have that belief. Hume, for example, doesn't use good or bad in reason involving senses. That's why he claims that it can't be contrary to reason to prefer your own acknowledged lesser good. Hume uses good and evil to mean pleasure and pain. When Hume calls pain bad, he means that pain is pain. While Hume would have thought it trivial to claim that pain is bad, Kant believed this claim to be false. Kant writes, "Good or evil is strictly speaking applied to actions, not to the person's state of feeling. Thus one may laugh at the Stoic who in the most intense pains of gout cried out, 'Pain, however much you torment me, I will still never admit that you are something evil, kakon malum.' Nonetheless, he was right." Kant misunderstands this Stoic, taking the Stoic to mean that his pain isn't morally bad. Feelings, Kant agrees, can't be morally bad. But the Stoic was denying that his pain is bad in the sense of being something that he has reasons to avoid. And Kant, I think, ignores that kind of badness. I believe that as well as being bad for the person who is in pain, pain is impersonally bad. On this view, if more people suffer, that would be worse, even though it may not be worse for any of these people. Pain is impersonally bad in the sense of being something that everyone has some reason to prevent or relieve if they can, not just the person in pain. Some philosophers assume that if some outcome would be bad, we have a prima facie duty to prevent this outcome if we can. Because Ross believed that we have no such duty to prevent our own pain, he concluded that our own pain isn't bad. Each person's pain is bad, Ross claims, only for other people, because only they have a duty to prevent it. Well, Ross reached that strange conclusion because he ignored or rejected these reason-involving kinds of badness. Even if we have no duty to prevent our own pain, this pain can be bad in the sense of being something that everyone, including us, has some reason to prevent. Such reasons we can call impartial in the sense that everyone has them, whatever their point of view. And we can call some outcome best in the impartial reason-involving sense if this outcome has features that give everyone the strongest impartial outcome-given reasons to prefer this outcome and to bring it about if they can. Now, that definition doesn't assume that all impartial reasons are outcome-given. We may have other impartial reasons, such as reasons provided by people's rights, and such reasons might outweigh our outcome-given reasons. Suppose that some poor person gives us some wallet bulging with banknotes that she's just found. We may believe both that we would make the outcome best if we told this person to keep the wallet, and that our reasons to produce this outcome are outweighed by our reasons to try to return the wallet to its rich owner. On this view, we may have the strongest impartial reasons both to try to find this owner and to hope that this attempt will fail so that we could then permissibly produce the best outcome by returning the wallet to its poor discoverer. Well, the view just sketched is semi-consequentialist in the sense that it gives some moral weight to the goodness of outcomes. On views that are consequentialist, the rightness of acts depends entirely on certain facts about what is non-morally good or bad. I mean, that's how I'm going to use the term. According to act consequentialists, acts are right just in case they make things go best. According to rule consequentialists, acts are right just in case they are permitted by one of the principles whose acceptance would make things go best. Now, consequentialists do best, I believe, to use best in the impartial reason-involving sense. We can call such people reason consequentialists. These consequentialists believe that, one, to answer moral questions, we must answer questions about rationality and reasons. Contractualists also believe that. But while consequentialists appeal to claims about which outcomes would be best, contractualists appeal to claims about what everyone could rationally choose. But when outcomes are best in the impartial reason-involving sense, they may be the outcomes that, from an impartial point of view, everyone could rationally choose. So, if consequentialists and contractualists make the same assumptions about rationality and reasons, their theories may coincide. Though consequentialists appeal to what is best and contractualists appeal to what everyone could rationally choose, these people may reach the same conclusions. They may find that, in Mill's phrase, they've been climbing the same mountain on opposite sides. These points have been widely overlooked. But that's not surprising. Many people don't use best in the impartial reason-involving sense. Some people make no use of the concept of a normative reason. Others accept desire-based theories about reasons or the self-interest theory. On these theories, there are no outcomes that everyone has some reason to want, since there are no outcomes that would be good for everyone or that would do something to fulfill everyone's informed desires. We should next distinguish between consequentialism and utilitarianism. Consequentialists believe that the rightness of acts depends only on facts about what would make things go best. Utilitarians believe that the rightness of acts depends only on facts about what would benefit people most. Now, some utilitarians are consequentialists since they believe that things go best when they go in the way that would benefit people most. But there are also some utilitarians who make no appeal to the goodness of outcomes. On one such view, we ought to do what would benefit people most because that is how we can best treat everyone with equal respect and concern. Just as some utilitarians aren't consequentialists, some consequentialists aren't utilitarians. These people accept that the rightness of acts depends only on facts about what would make things go best, but they reject the other two claims I read out. They believe that, you can get them from what they believe, they believe that it would often be best if things went in some way that did not benefit people most. And on the view that's most relevant here, how well things go depends in part on how benefits and burdens are distributed between different people. On this view, one of two outcomes could be better, though it would involve a smaller sum of benefits, because these benefits would be more equally distributed, or because more of these benefits would go to people who are worse off. In their beliefs about the goodness of outcomes, these consequentialists accept distributive principles. Rawls claims that if a moral theory includes such principles, it's not consequentialist. In his words, the problem of distribution falls under the concept of right as one intuitively understands it, and so the theory lacks an independent definition of the good. Well, as we've seen, that may not be true. Reason consequentialists use good in the impartial reason-involving sense. When these people claim that the rightness of acts depends only on facts about what would make things go best, they mean that the rightness of acts depends only on facts about what everyone has most reason to want from an impartial point of view. These people may claim that the goodness of outcomes depends in part on the distribution of benefits and burdens because they believe that everyone has such impartial reasons to want benefits to be more equally distributed or to want benefits to go to people who are worse off. And there's no useful sense in which that view isn't consequentialist. Last lap coming up. Kant wasn't a consequentialist. But we are considering not Kant's moral beliefs, but the implications of his principles. According to Kant's consent principle, we ought to treat people only in ways to which they could rationally consent. Act consequentialists can argue everyone could rationally consent to being treated in any way that would make things go best. Therefore, the consent principle never implies that such acts are wrong. Now, that argument's premise, I believe, is true. I believe that in Lifeboat, for example, White could rationally consent to our leaving her to die so that in the time available we could save the 5. Well, if that's true, that view strongly supports the claim that everyone could rationally consent to being treated in any way that would make things go best, if we could rationally consent to being left to die when and because that is what makes things go best. That strongly suggests that we could rationally give consent to having lesser burdens imposed on us for that reason. Well, if that argument is sound, as I believe, Kant's consent principle could be accepted by act consequentialists. Kant's contractualist formula, however, provides one premise of a counter-argument. We can claim we ought to act on the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. We couldn't all rationally will that everyone accepts the act consequentialist principle. Therefore, this isn't the principle on which we ought to act. And this argument, I believe, is also sound. Sidgwick reluctantly concluded that we couldn't rationally want it to be true that everyone accepts act utilitarianism. Of Sidgwick's reasons for reaching that conclusion, most would apply to act consequentialism. If everyone believed that it was right to do whatever would make things go best, that would be unlikely to make things go best. Well-known reasons: make excuses in your favor, stealing is all right if I need it more than him, etc. Things would be likely to go better if everyone had certain other moral beliefs. Wrong to steal. If we knew that to be true, we couldn't rationally will that everyone accepts act consequentialism, so Kant's formula would imply that we should reject this view, with some help from Sidgwick. Return now to rule consequentialism. On this view, we ought to act on the principles whose acceptance would make things go best. Now, that view is very different from act consequentialism. Partly for the reasons Sidgwick gave, rule consequentialism supports principles which are much closer to most people's moral beliefs. Rule consequentialists can appeal to Kant's contractualist formula. They can argue, it's my last argument, A, we ought to act on the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. B, everyone could rationally will whatever they would have most reason to will from an impartial point of view. C, what everyone would have most reason to will from this point of view is that everyone accepts the principles whose universal acceptance would make things go best. Therefore, these are the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. Therefore, these are the principles on which we ought to act. Now, if we accept Kant's formula, which is premise A, accepting B and C would commit us to rule consequentialism. Some people would reject C because they believe that there's no intelligible sense in which things might go better or worse. Many philosophers keep saying that. But if these people have the concept of a normative reason, as some of them seem to do, they must understand the claim that some outcomes would be best in the impartial reason-involving sense. Well, these people might claim that there are no such outcomes since there are no impartial reasons. And this must be claimed by those who accept either desire-based theories about reasons or the self-interest theory. I'm assuming, though, that we should reject these theories. We all have reasons to want some outcomes, such as those in which fewer people suffer or die young, and there are some principles whose acceptance would, in this impartial sense, make things go best or equal best. When we apply Kant's formula, we ask which principles everyone could rationally will or choose if each person supposed that everyone would accept whatever principles she herself chose. Now, if each person chose the principles whose acceptance would make things go best, that choice would itself make things go best. And according to premise C, that is the choice that from an impartial point of view, everyone would have most reason to make. Now, we might challenge C by appealing to our non-consequentialist moral beliefs. We might claim that if people accepted the principles whose acceptance would make things go best, that would sometimes lead these people to act wrongly. But such claims are irrelevant here. When we apply some contractualist formula, we shouldn't appeal to our beliefs about the wrongness of acts. As Rawls says, we should bracket these beliefs. Otherwise, the formula would be trivial. As I say, according to contractualists, whether acts are wrong depends on which principles everyone could rationally choose, and that would be trivial if which principles everyone could rationally choose depended on which acts are wrong. So we should appeal to our moral beliefs only at a different stage, when we are deciding whether to accept some version of contractualism. If it's too deeply counterintuitive, we'll reject it. There are, I believe, no other grounds on which we could reject premise C. if each person chose that everyone accepts the principles whose acceptance would make things go best, this choice would itself make things go best in the impartial reason-involving sense. In other words, this is the choice that each person would have the strongest impartial outcome-given reasons to make. Now, such reasons may be outweighed by other conflicting impartial reasons, since there may be cases in which we ought not to choose what would make things go best. But as we've just seen, no such conflicting reasons are relevant here. We can't appeal to our beliefs about right and wrong, nor would it be plausible to claim that the people who we are discussing in this imagined thought experiment, that it would be morally wrong for them to choose the principles whose general acceptance would make things go best. I mean, it's not as if in doing that they'd be breaking a promise or something of the kind. So C is restricted to the particular case of the choices that would be made in this thought experiment. If no such conflicting reasons are relevant here, then I think all that are left are the impartial outcome-given reasons, and that's enough to show that everyone could rationally, that's what everyone would have most reason to choose from an impartial point of view. Now, according to the argument's remaining premise, everyone could rationally will or choose whatever they have most reason to choose from this point of view. Now, that claim isn't consequentialist, since it doesn't assume that all reasons are outcome-given. And I did have several pages defending that claim, but I've now realized that it's enough for me to make a much weaker claim. I believe that in many cases, where no other special considerations apply, we could rationally choose what would make things go best, whatever the cost to ourselves. We could rationally give up our life to save 2 strangers, or even 1 stranger. But this argument doesn't require an assumption at all as strong as that. And one way of bringing that out, which is topical on this gloomy election post-mortem day, is to make a point about referenda, not as they actually occur, particularly in America, but how, thinking more rationally, they should occur. Let's just compare 4 choices. If some rich person asks herself whether she thinks she should or would give $10,000 a year to the poorest people, on some of the poorest people, the people who earn less than $2 a day, I think she could rationally give that. Some people may think, no, she doesn't have sufficient reason. 10,000 is quite a lot of money. But that isn't what this argument needs. Suppose that that person could choose to give up $10,000 a year in a way that gave to the poorest people in the world $10,000 million a year. That's to say, $10 billion a year. Well, then she would have sufficient reason to give up the 10,000, even on a pretty weak version of this kind of view. We merely need to suppose that her reasons to care about the well-being of the poorest people in the world aren't more than 1 million times weaker than her reasons to care about herself. Similarly, to take a case where people are more likely to resist the initial claim about rationality, we can have a case in which we're reallocating resources in a way that affects people's health and life expectancy. And suppose the question is, could one person rationally choose a distribution that would reduce her life from 80 years to 70 so that one other person could live to 60 rather than 20? Well, it's a lot to give up 10 years of life, even to give 40 years to someone who'd die at 20. Some of us may think we can't claim that everyone has sufficient reason to make that great a sacrifice. But suppose that by giving up 10 years of life, we could enable 10 million people to live to 60 instead of 20. Well, then I think we do have sufficient reason to give up 10 years. Well, that may seem irrelevant. I mean, how could we have this ability by giving up $10,000 to give to the poorest people in the world $10,000 million? Easy. Have a referendum. You just need to suppose that there are a million rich people, and the referendum is that everyone will be taxed. $10,000 will go to the poorest people in the world. Well, if I vote, if I have the casting vote in this referendum, and I vote yes, it's only going to cost me $10,000, but it will make $10 billion go to the poorest people in the world. Now, that is in effect how this premise of this argument could go, because we're asking what everyone could rationally will if she were choosing the principles that everyone would accept. And we can assume that many people would act on them. Well, if you choose the principles that everyone accept, the principles that would on the whole make things go best, compared with some set that would make things go a lot worse, that's very like the cases I've just done. Even if you know that these principles that would make things go best would impose some burdens on you, the benefits to others would be so enormous that I think you have sufficient reason to make that choice. Well, that's all I need to say, I think, to defend the argument, so I just end with very brief conclusions. According to Kant's formula, we ought to act on the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. As I've now argued, what everyone could rationally will is that everyone accepts the principles whose acceptance would make things go best. So on Kant's formula, these are the principles on which we ought to act, and that's what ruled consequentialists believe. Now, as well as providing an argument for ruled consequentialism, Kant's formula may give this view a stronger foundation. According to many ruled consequentialists, what ultimately matters is how well things go. If that's true, however, why is it wrong to act in ways that would make things go best when and because such acts aren't permitted by certain principles? That's the standard objection. Well, ruled consequentialism may instead be founded on Kantian contractualism. What's fundamental here isn't the belief that it ultimately matters most how well things go. It's the belief that we ought to act on the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. Now, on this view, what everyone could rationally will is that everyone accepts the principles whose acceptance would make things go best. But because this view appeals to Kant's formula, it may better resist the thought that it can't be wrong to do what would make things go best. Such acts may be wrong, not because they contravene the principles whose acceptance would make things go best, but because they contravene the principles whose acceptance everyone could rationally will. Well, I haven't been defending ruled consequentialism. My aim has been in part cartographical. On one standard moral map, most of us are shown as holding pluralist views of the kind that Sidgwick calls common sense morality. This map also shows two main kinds of systematic theory. One kind, a consequentialist, with utilitarian theories as the main examples. The other kind, are Kantian theories and various forms of neo-Kantian contractualism. Now, this map, I've argued, should be redrawn. Of the different ways of thinking about morality, it's Kantian and contractualist theories that do most to support consequentialism. And that isn't surprising. Rawls writes that in adopting his contractualist formula, we have substituted for an ethical judgment a judgment of rational prudence. Rawls's version of contractualism makes some moral assumptions, as in the way in which, by imposing a veil of ignorance, Rawls makes our reasoning impartial. But in applying Rawls's formula, we can't appeal to our beliefs about which acts are wrong. So we should expect to reach utilitarian conclusions. As I've said, utilitarianism is roughly rational prudence plus impartiality. Rawls's aim was in part to provide an alternative to utilitarianism. By turning to Kant's contractualist formula, I've argued we can achieve that aim. On Kant's formula, we appeal to the principles whose choice would be rational, not in purely self-interested terms, but in response to every kind of reason. These principles, we can argue, aren't utilitarian. By appealing to Kant's formula, I believe we can support various distributive principles, and this formula allows us to defend other non-utilitarian principles, such as principles about retributive justice or some kinds of perfectionism. Now, I would reject that, but the retributive justice, but it's allowed for as a possible move. Though Kant's formula counts against utilitarianism, it supports consequentialism. And as before, that isn't surprising. On this formula, we achieve impartiality by appealing to the principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally choose, and in applying the formula, we can't appeal to our beliefs about which acts are wrong. So we should expect to reach consequentialist conclusions. What everyone could rationally choose are the principles whose acceptance would make things go best. Consequentialism is roughly wide value-based rationality plus impartiality. Well, if we believe that we ought to avoid consequentialist conclusions, the obvious course is to think about morality not in a Kantian or contractualist way, but in Sidgwick's way. Now that claim may seem surprising since Sidgwick is an act utilitarian. But Sidgwick assumes that we must appeal to our beliefs about which acts are wrong. This appeal should be critical since we should try to clarify these beliefs and we should consider all good arguments for and against them. The longest part of Sidgwick's Methods of Ethics does just that. But, Sidgwick thought, we can't hope to answer moral questions by appealing only to claims about what everyone could rationally choose. We must appeal to our moral intuitions. There is, however, an alternative. Scanlon claims that rather than appealing to the principles that everyone could rationally choose, we should appeal to the principles that no one could reasonably reject. And Scanlon's contractualist formula appeals to claims about what's reasonable in a moral sense, but that does not, as some suggest, make that formula circular or trivial. And of the different versions of contractualism, only Scanlon's, I believe, may be as good as the Kantian formula when combined with the view about rationality and reasons that Scanlon and I both accept.
Okay, we'll now hear from the third of our three commentators, Professor Thomas Scanlon. Professor Scanlon is the Alford Professor of Natural Religion, Moral Philosophy, and Civil Polity at Harvard, where he's taught since 1984, after having taught at Princeton for the previous 18 years. Professor Scanlon is one of the leading moral and political philosophers of our day. His 1999 book, What We Owe to Each Other, is one of the landmarks of contemporary moral philosophy. He's a former Tanner lecturer himself and also a former MacArthur Fellow. And as we've just heard, according to Derek Parfit, he's Kantian moral philosophy's last best hope, so we're particularly lucky to have him with us today. Tim? Yes.
Thank you. There's a great deal in this extremely rich and complex lecture that we might discuss. So in my comments, I'll have to be selective. I'll resist the temptation to talk about the early discussion of Rawls and some of the later cartological points that Parfit makes. And I'll concentrate simply on the argument that's offered at the very end of the lecture on page 3 of your handout to show that what Parfit calls Kant's contractualist formula leads to, or at least does not exclude, rule consequentialism. What I'll do really is just to walk you carefully through this part of the argument, since it seems to me that this is where we're likely to find the Gavagayan moment, or the occasion of Lapine manifestation, or whatever you want to call it. So you can turn to page 3 of your lucky number programs there and look at A, B, and C. Looking first at A, you'll recall that Parfit states Kant's contractualist formula as follows: we ought to act on principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. This principle appears to be at least potentially permissive. That is, it leaves open the possibility that there is more than one set of principles whose universal acceptance everyone could rationally will. In this case, the principle wouldn't entail that we must act on one of these principles rather than the other. Acting on either would presumably be at least morally permissible. So what the argument Parfit is offering may show is that according to this formula, we are morally permitted to act on rule consequentialism, but not necessarily that we are required to do so if there's also some other principle that everyone could rationally will. The second step in Parfit's argument is a claim about what people could in fact rationally will. And here I'm going to concentrate on the argument as printed rather than the more colorful and emotionally and morally gripping reformulation which Derek gave in his concluding remarks. I'll return to that variant in a little ad lib a little later on, but I'll follow my own text here and sticking with the original formulation. So in the original formulation, B said, everyone could rationally will whatever they would have most reason to will from an impartial point of view.
I was keeping that formulation.
You were, yes. Yeah. Okay, yeah, right. Well, you're just arguing for it by you. Is that right? So you were giving a different argument for it than sorry, it wasn't a reformulation. All right. I'll say something about that argument a little later on. My first observation here is that, as Alan Wood remarked in his comments on Parfit's first lecture, this is a rather, I might say, distinctly un-Kantian idea of what one could will. When Kant speaks of what one could or could not will, he has in mind what he takes to be the constraints on willing that are constitutive of rational agency itself. We couldn't will something if, in so willing, we would violate these constraints. He does not, that is, Kant does not, I think, take the question of whether one could rationally will a certain action to be one that we should answer, as Parfit does, by asking whether one could have sufficient reason for so acting, taking into account the balance of reasons on opposing sides. Weighing reasons in this way is not something that Kant engages in, to mine, not very much anyway. And indeed, I think that many have been attracted to Kant's view in part because it seemed to provide a way of answering moral questions without appeal to this kind of balancing of reasons. It may be that, as I myself believe, this appeal is illusory, because the weighing of conflicting reasons can't be avoided in reaching moral conclusions. But in adopting a criterion of what one can will, which depends upon the balance of reasons in this way, what Parfit calls Kant's contractualist formula departs from Kant in, I think, an important way, and remains Kantian only in a looser modern sense. This second step in Parfit's argument claims that in order to show that a person could rationally will a given principle, it is sufficient to show that this principle is what that person has most reason to will from an impartial point of view. So, what is an impartial point of view? I take it that this point of view is defined, as Parfit says of an argument of Rawls's in another context, by subtraction. It's defined by beginning with all the reasons that a person has, and then dropping from consideration all the reasons that depend on how the object of willing is related to that person, him or herself. This includes, for example, the reasons one has to favor an outcome because it would be better for oneself, and the reasons one has for favoring an outcome because it would be better for one's family or one's friends or one's favorite football team, and so on. What someone would have most reason to will from an impartial point of view is what he or she would have most reason to will, leaving aside all such person-relative reasons. So if these person-relative reasons are left out, what is left in? I'll mention several categories. First, there are what might be called purely impersonal reasons. Suppose I decide to give money to the Berkeley Physics Department because I think that discovering fundamental truths about the nature of the universe is something worth doing, something we all have reason to support. That would be an impersonal, purely impersonal reason. It has to do with simply thinking of this objective as being one that we have reason to achieve because of its inherent properties. Insofar as we don't think that my giving my money away in this fashion would be foolish or mere caprice, we must agree that the investigation of such truths is something that one has at least some reason to support. I also might support, on similar grounds, general education in science or advanced education in science for a variety of people, or education in music, because I think that these forms of education promote the development of talents in people that are intrinsically valuable, deep scientific understanding or musical understanding and skill. These would be, I think, what Parfit calls perfectionist reasons when he says we might have, because they have to do with developing valuable talents in people. Now, I might think that the reasons that I have to support research in physics would count equally in favor of supporting basic research in biochemistry, just another way of forwarding the goal of understanding the fundamental truths about the universe and the life within it. But I might decide that the fact that biochemical research not only would uncover these deep truths, but also might lead to the prevention of disease and to the alleviation of human suffering. And I might think that this provides me with an additional reason for supporting that kind of research. So I might switch my gift from physics to biochemistry. I know the chancellor isn't here today, but if he were here, I could do this, I suppose, if I had actually given any money. This would also be an impartial reason, right? The first impartial reasons had to do with simply the value of these accomplishments. Second kind of impartial reasons would have to do with the value of alleviating suffering and combating disease. Would this second kind of impartial reason be a moral reason? It would certainly be a morally approvable reason. We might think that a person who gave money for that on that ground was a good chap for that reason. But as Parfit said, in responding to John Searle's question in the discussion after the first lecture, even if I gave my money to biochemistry for this reason, I might not be doing it because I took this to be morally required. I might just think that suffering is in itself something that anyone who can prevent has reason to prevent. And I agree with Parfit that in this case, we shouldn't say that my reason is a moral one unless all that we mean by this is that it's one which properly elicits moral approval. It's not a response to morality, even though it elicits, I might say, moral approval. It need not be. But this distinction between reasons that are, say, morally approvable, but independent of morality, and those that are genuinely moral in their basis, may be more difficult to draw in some of the other cases to which Parfit refers. Parfit says that the reasons we have from an impartial point of view include considerations of distribution and also considerations of retributive justice. I take it that what he has in mind here is this. If two social situations involve the same aggregate well-being, but in one case this well-being is much more evenly distributed, much more equally distributed than in the other, this fact could provide us with reasons to prefer that situation, the more equal one. Would this be a moral reason? Well, it clearly would be a moral reason if it were just the reason that inequality is morally objectionable, so its alleviation is something morality requires us to prefer. It may be less clear than it was in the case of suffering and the elimination of disease what other form this reason could take than as a reason that has this kind of moral foundation. I see the force of this claim, but I think there's also something to be said on the other side, which is, I take it, the side that Parfit has in mind in formulating his view. In a society marked by a high degree of inequality, some people may lack any degree of meaningful control over their lives. They may also have the burden of being stigmatized in the eyes of their fellows and hence in their own eyes as inferior and unworthy. Like suffering, lack of control and stigmatization in the eyes of others and hence in your own as unworthy and inferior are things that people have reason to want to avoid. They're bad for people, you might say. And they are therefore also things that other people have reasons to regret and to want to see alleviated. This would be so, I think, even if, although this is hard to imagine, these forms of stigmatization or lack of control were brought about in ways that were not in themselves unjust, through some kind of natural accident or something. So, I think one might have an impartial, although not explicitly moral reason for preferring a more equal distribution to a less equal one. I leave aside the question of whether the same might be said in regard to retributive justice, that is to say, in regard to the reasons somebody might have for preferring outcomes in which well-being is distributed in a way that is more in accord with moral merit. Finally, the reasons that, I think in Parfit's view, one has from an impartial point of view include reasons whose basis does lie, unlike the ones I've just been outlining as not necessarily essentially moral, but impartial reasons in his view also include reasons whose basis does lie in moral requirements. So, for example, the fact that an action would be wrong or would violate someone's rights can give us a reason not to do it. And we have reasons, perhaps, to prefer certain kinds of institutions to others because they're just and don't involve the violation of people's rights. These are impartial reasons, too. And we might have impartial reasons of this kind, perhaps, to promote the welfare of our children. These now wouldn't be partial reasons, personal reasons. It's not just that because they're my children, I love them and care more about them than everybody else, but because I'm their parent, I have an obligation to take care of them. So I would have a morally based reason to take care of them, and I hope, we might say, given the age I've now reached, that children, have the same kind of impartial reason to take care of their parents as well. Okay, so we have many kinds of impartial reasons, many of them non-moral, but in the last analysis, some moral reasons as well. The class of reasons that, according to Parfit, one has from an impartial point of view is thus very broad. And the claim that anyone could rationally will whatever he or she would have most reason to will from an impartial point of view draws strength from this breadth. Right? It's the fact that the reasons one has from an impartial point of view aren't all of the reasons one has, but they include enough that if there's a case based on those reasons to do something, then you can conclude that the rest of the reasons aren't going to outweigh it. Now, what are the reasons that might outweigh it? Well, the reasons that might outweigh it are mainly personal reasons of personal sacrifice. Of course, though, any sacrifice on your part will already have been taken into account impartially because it's someone's sacrifice, right? So Parfit's idea is that given that they've already been taken into account in the impartial reason, your personal reasons can't make it irrational for you to do what you have most reason to do from an impartial point of view. Just let me say one thing, though, here about the revised or the additional argument that Derek offered in the talk. What we're tending toward here is a conclusion about rule consequentialism taken as a view that would differ in its consequences or might differ in its consequences from alternative forms of contractualism, let's say. And it seems to me that the examples that Derek mentioned, where by making a certain sacrifice, we could bring huge benefits to people elsewhere, not just huge in the aggregate, but also huge to each one of them in that example. It's likely that other forms of contractualism would also require the same, those contributions in that case. What we're interested in here is a case for rule consequentialism, which might deviate, might require things of us that other contractualist views wouldn't require. So I think it's crucial that we focus on the content of B, which says that, to go back to B here, I'm not just a ad lib it, everyone could rationally will whatever they have most reason to will from an impartial point of view. it seems to me that not every case of what you have reason to will from an impartial point of view will be one in which the advantages are so staggeringly great. In many cases they will, right? But I don't think you can explain in your reply, but I don't see that it follows that whenever one has this, right? In many cases, so it seems to me the more controversial cases would be the cases where that wasn't true. But no doubt we'll get persuaded later that that's true in every case. So, as I said, the case for B, the idea that it's at least sufficient, we have at least sufficient reason, maybe not conclusive, but sufficient reason to do whatever we have reason to do from an impartial point of view, depends upon the breadth of that category. The effect of the next step in the argument, step C, is somewhat to narrow that breadth. C says, what everyone would have most reason to will from an impartial point of view is that everyone accepts the principles whose general acceptance would make everything go best. Well, when does everything go best? Everything goes best in the sense that Parfit has in mind here if it goes in the way that we have what he calls the strongest impartial outcome-based reasons for wanting it to go. This is a consequentialist idea, but not a utilitarian one. Impartial outcome-based reasons include impartial reasons of all the kinds I've listed, except for those in my last category, except possibly for those, that is, the morally based ones. At least he certainly means to exclude some of the reasons in that last category, since that includes reasons that are not outcome-based, but depend on things like violations of rights and the wrongness of particular forms of behavior. I'm not certain whether he means to exclude all of them. I will assume that that's probably what's going on, but let's continue. It's important to ask then why it is that some or all of the reasons in the third category, the morally based category, shouldn't be taken into account in determining when things go best, right? That's what C does, is to narrow our focus from all the impartial reasons we've got to the outcome-based ones. Now, on a utilitarian conception, we'd have a ready answer, because the considerations in that final category, the morally based ones, would be ruled out because they are not in themselves matters of individual well-being, and that's all that counts according to utilitarianism. Perhaps the consequentialist conception that Parfit has in mind might be said to rule them out because they're not reasons for preferring outcomes. This wouldn't rule out all the reasons in the last category. I think one might have explicitly moral reasons for preferring a state of affairs, let's say a state of affairs in which no one's rights are violated, to one in which rights violations occur. But I don't think that outcome-based moral reasons of this kind capture all the force of morality as we ordinarily understand it and as I accept it. I believe we have reasons not to violate people's rights which aren't reducible to reasons to prevent the occurrence of rights violations. This is a familiar dividing point between consequentialist outlooks and deontological ones, but I don't see any grounds inherent in the argument being considered so far for adopting this consequentialist restriction. This is an argument for consequentialism. It's not supposed to pick up any consequentialist assumptions along the way. So there's another reason for excluding the reasons in my third category, I think. And this is relevant not to the idea of consequentialism, but to the supposed and assumed purposes of the argument we are considering and the purposes and aims of Kant's contractualist formula in particular. The idea is that what we're trying to do in deploying a principle like Kant's contractualist formula is to establish a procedure for answering questions about the rightness and wrongness of actions. So we should not appeal in carrying out that procedure to these very considerations. That is, we shouldn't appeal to our ideas about which actions are right and which actions are wrong. We can understand this rationale along the same lines as Rawls's rationale for excluding appeal to ideas of justice from the range of reasons that are to be considered by the parties to his original position in deciding which principles to accept. That would defeat the purpose of the exercise, and the assumption here is that Kant's contractualist formula is an exercise of the same kind. One might wonder why, then, we can allow people's reasons for accepting or not accepting a principle to include ideas about which distributions are objectionably unequal, or about when people are or are not getting the punishment they deserve. And I take it that Parfit's response would be that, as I argued above on his behalf, these reasons do not need to be at base moral reasons. They may track morality, they may be morally approvable, but we might have reasons for caring about those things which wasn't caring about them because they're right or because they're otherwise it would be unjust or something like that. So these are reasons that can be included within the ambit of consequentialism of the kind we're discussing and can be appealed to without jeopardizing the aims of the construction. What this rationale seems to support, however, is not the exclusion of all reasons that are not outcome-based, but the exclusion of all morally based reasons. Sorry, not the exclusion of all reasons that are not outcome-based, but the exclusion of all morally based reasons, no matter whether they are outcome-based or not. The result would then be to exclude all non-consequentialist reasons, but also perhaps some reasons that a consequentialist might appeal to, thus yielding a slightly restricted form of rule consequentialism. But that's okay. It's rule consequentialism nonetheless. The reasons that remain will be allowed not because, considered as reasons, they form some significant class, but because the objectives of the principle under consideration do not require their exclusion. The conclusion that Parfit arrives at in this way could, it seems to me, be generalized as follows. As long as we understand what Parfit calls Kant's contractualist formula in the way he proposes, a form of rule consequentialism will always be one possible outcome. The only way to avoid it will be to make the argument circular by bringing in as reasons people have for will. The only way we could exclude it would be by bringing in as reasons people have for willing or not willing the acceptance of a principle, the very non-consequentialist moral considerations that the argument seeks to support. So this doesn't mean that Kant's contractualist formula has to lead to consequentialism, because, as I said earlier, these steps are permissive. They just say it's not going to be contrary to reason, so to speak, to choose the consequentialist path. So where does this bias toward consequentialism come in? There seem to me to be two steps. The first is the formulation of the relevant thought experiment, as one in which we ask, looking at things from each person's point of view in turn, what principles he or she could will to be universally accepted. The second step is the appeal to impartiality, which may serve here as something of a dialectical Trojan horse. The restriction to impartial reasons seems at first an entirely plausible and innocent move. After all, it doesn't seem that one's conclusions about what is morally right should depend upon how one personally would stand to benefit from reaching a particular conclusion rather than another. But suppose for a moment that we ourselves will not be affected one way or the other by the acceptance or rejection of a certain principle, since we're never involved in the kind of situation to which such a principle would apply. The idea of others, however, may be affected greatly by the adoption or non-adoption of this principle. By its adoption might affect some of them in a very seriously negative way, while bringing small benefits to a large number of others. The idea of contractualism, normally understood, is that we should ask in such a case whether the claims of the few who will be affected negatively are adequately answered by citing, you've got to accept that because of the benefits that are brought to other particular people. We confront these claims one-on-one and we ask, does the benefit that a person on the benefiting side get constitute an adequate answer to the person who is suffering the loss on the other side? Surely, in answering this question, we should be impartial. That is to say, we should consider these claims on their merits. Now I'm supposing that we are ourselves not affected, right? We're just choosing these principles to only affect other people. But we should be impartial. We should consider these claims on their merits without bias, without asking whether we have any affection for one person on one side, whether we know the person on the other side, and so on. But does this mean that we must answer the question by asking what would overall result in the best outcome? Produce the greatest sum of benefits? Of course, it would seem to me, you're not going to be surprised to hear, that it doesn't. Impartiality does not entail consequentialism. But Parfit's claim is not that the question in this case must be answered in this way in order to be impartial. He claims only that it may be so answered. Such an answer is not excluded. As long as a person's sacrifice would result in a state of affairs that was impartially better, he or she would not be open to rational criticism for making that choice. They would have sufficient reason to make it. But we are choosing principles here for other people, right? And can we impose on someone else in making that choice any sacrifice that he or she would not be crazy to make, would not be positively irrational to make? This seems to me a chillingly permissive criterion. And I suppose that this is just Parfit's point against Kant's contractualist formula. I agree with that point, although I do not find it very surprising. Once we see the permissive character of the formula, once we see that it's just asking what people could accept, it's not so surprising that we think, well, people could accept. Yeah, they could accept that. But what level of sacrifice can we demand of people without their actual consent? If this is too permissive, where does it become too much to ask to impose this for the greater good? This is clearly a moral question. And the second thing that's worrying about Parfit's argument is the suggestion that there's no way of answering this question within a contractualist framework in a non-question begging way. By setting up contractualism in a way that contains some answer to that question, we'll be bringing in the very kind of consideration that the contractualist system was meant to answer, the contractualist procedure was meant to answer. This might seem self-defeating for contractualism. I think Parfit and I both hope, or maybe even both believe, that it's not. But whether it is or isn't is, as Parfit says, a question for another occasion.
Now, let me start with a comment about your response to the referendum. I didn't make clear enough how that applied, and also the role of that premise in the argument. Premise B doesn't claim that everyone could always rationally choose whatever they have most reason to choose from an impartial point of view. I don't need that claim. As it stands, premise B just says, in this thought experiment, people could rationally choose whatever they have reason to choose, because their other reasons for not making that choice don't apply in this thought experiment. And now the point about the referendum, it isn't that this version of contractualism can justify voting yes for a referendum whereby if I give up the $10,000, but so do the other million rich people, 10 billion will go to the poor. Certainly other versions of contractualism can explain that too. My point just was that, since that premise is about what people could rationally choose in the thought experiment, the question that they are facing is very like the question that we'd be facing in casting the decisive vote in such a referendum. That was my only point. It was that in making that choice, the person might know, since there's no veil of ignorance, the person is rich, she will know that if she votes for the principles that would make things go best, those principles are going to be more redistributive than many other principles. They will impose great taxes on the rich to help the poor. So in voting for those principles, she's voting to incur a cost. But the benefit that she's producing is 1,000,000 times greater than the cost, in my small example. In this case, of course, it's billions of times greater, because it's everyone, not just now, but in the future. So it was entirely directed at that point in the argument. It isn't the general claim that everyone could always rationally choose what, from an impartial point of view, they have most reason to choose. Now, I'll just very quickly go through these comments on the screen. I agree that the version of contractualism I've been presenting isn't Kant's, because it appeals to a view about rationality and reasons that is very unlike Kant's view. That's why I spoke of Kant's contractualist formula. I think the formula is very close to Kant. The principles whose acceptance everyone could rationally will. And I think that that formula, as I say, it's just the collective version of that form of the formula of universal law in which we appeal to the principles that each of us could rationally will to be universal. And we just say, which are the ones that everyone could will. And I think it's much closer to Kant than, say, Rawls's version of contractualism, partly because, as we've seen, Rawls is assuming something like the rational agreement formula. He imposes the veil of ignorance to limit people's bargaining power. So that conception of contractualism is the one on which, if you don't have a veil of ignorance, you get to the decisive final vote, and you have to know whether you can believe people's threats and warnings that they're not going to vote for the principle you've said you'd vote for, and so on. That is completely alien to Kant. The pressure of the need to reach agreement, making people make concessions to one another, and whether they believe each other's threats couldn't be more un-Kantian. What is un-Kantian is the view about rationality and reasons. I agree with that. As Scanlon says, when Kant speaks of what one could or could not will, he has in mind the constraints on willing that are constitutive of rational agency itself. We could not will something if so willing it would violate these constraints. Well, there are two reasons why in developing a moral view we might appeal only to the constraints on willing that are constitutive of rational agency. Let me give one example of those. I mean, it would be you can't rationally will an end, but fail to will what you know to be the necessary and unobjectionable means to the end. That's constitutive of rational willing. Means ends rationality. Well, of the reasons for building a moral theory on such slender premises, one would be that it would be a more striking, successful achievement. We could show that any rational agent, on pain of inconsistency or ceasing even to be a rational agent, must accept our conclusions. That argument would have enormous importance, and moral philosophers continually try to do that. Gautier, for example, claims that by appealing to instrumental rationality, you can show that everyone's rationally required to obey his minimal morality and not to kill people from whose existence you benefit. I think that project just can't succeed, and I think Scanlon agrees. And if people have been attracted to Kant's view because they've seen that that would be a more successful argument, yes, I think it doesn't work. Now, there's another reason why Kant and later Kantians might appeal only to these constraints on rational agency. That may be the total of their conception of non-moral rationality, maybe a very thin conception. And I think many Kantians do have a very thin conception. When Honora O'Neill rejects the rational consent principle, she assumes that in asking whether someone could rationally consent to being treated in some way, all we'd be appealing to is whether there'd be an internal inconsistency given that person's desires. She does mention the alternative of appealing to a substantive account of rationality, appealing to claims about ends that are good, but she says that that's unacceptable since it commits you to an unbelievable form of Platonism. And I think Kant himself didn't have a rich conception of reasons in between instrumental rationality and morality. That's what I said yesterday. Okay, next point. Well, what's an impartial point of view? The argument appeals to impartial point of view. Scanlon says this is defined by subtraction. That's not inaccurate, but it's a much too thin description, and that's partly because it ignores the idea of an impartial point of view. Now, there are several ways of defining such a point of view. Most straightforwardly, we can ask what we could rationally choose or have reason to prefer if we were not involved, if we were an impartial observer. More complicated but more accurate, I think, is the way in which, as Nagel particularly eloquently argues, throughout our life, not just in practical reasoning, science, and everything, we have this constant ability to shift back and throw from our personal point of view and an impartial point of view. And in epistemic reasoning, the impartial point of view is the objective point of view, and so on. I think it shortchanges the idea what we could will from an impartial point of view to just say that's reasons with some of them crossed out. But that's a minor point. Now, I turn to the objection to the crucial steps in the argument. Scanlon says that my class of impartial reasons is very broad, but I then seem to narrow the breadth. I'm excluding an appeal to explicitly moral reasons, reasons that are given by the rightness of acts. But he then says it's important to ask why some or all of these reasons shouldn't count in determining when things go best. And that wasn't my claim. They can count as helping to determine what makes things go best. We can agree that it's worse if more people's rights are violated. It's just that, as Scanlon went on to say, in applying a contractualist formula, the only kinds of reasons that we can't appeal to are ones that presuppose our beliefs about what's right and wrong, and that's going to presuppose, that will be true of our beliefs about what people's rights are. Scanlon then says, what this rationale seems to support, the one I've just given, is not the exclusion of all reasons that aren't outcome-based, but the exclusion of all morally based reasons, whether outcome-based or not. Now, I have no idea which kinds of reason Scanlon has in mind there, so that's just a question. Now, however, it's quite important that C is not narrowing down the range of admissible reasons in any way other than this minimal way to make the formula avoid being circular and trivial. And many non-consequentialist reasons remain fully relevant. That's true of all the personal reasons provided by our own well-being or that of our children, those we love, and so on. In asking which of the principles that everyone could rationally choose in the thought experiment, there's no exclusion of their personal reasons and the reasons provided by the well-being of those they love. So you say, surely in answering this question we should be impartial, but does that mean that we must answer it by asking what would be overall the best outcome? It, of course, seems to me that it doesn't. Impartiality doesn't entail consequentialism. Again, I think that misunderstands the argument. I know it may look like a rabbit out of the hat getting exercise. I don't think it is. My claim isn't that impartiality entails consequentialism. It's that impartiality plus contractualism, which tells you to exclude appeal to your beliefs about the wrongness of acts, may entail some form of ruled consequentialism. And so, as Scanlon rightly went on to say, this argument can be taken not as an argument for ruled consequentialism, but as an argument against contractualism. I'm happy to have it taken that way. Now, finally, the main substantive question at the end. Take the cases of the great burdens that we could impose on a few people for the sake of the greater sum of benefits to others. Now, when we ask whether Kant's formula supports a principle which allows us to impose those great burdens, we don't answer that by asking whether that principle's acceptance would result overall in the best outcome. Kant's formula imposes a limit on the burdens that people can be permissibly made to bear for the sake of benefits to others. And it's nothing to do with the goodness of the outcomes. It must be true that these people could rationally choose to bear these burdens for the sake of these benefits. If they couldn't, then we can't impose it on them. And then finally, this is the last thing I shall comment on. Parfit's claim is not that the question must be answered in this way to be impartial. He claims only that it may be so answered. As long as a person's sacrifice would result in a state of affairs that was impartially better, he or she would not be open to rational criticism in making it. But can we impose on someone else any sacrifice that he or she would not be crazy to make? That seems to me a chillingly permissive criterion, and I suppose that's Parfit's point against Kant's contractualist formula. I agree with the point, although I don't find it very surprising. For some reason, I'm reminded of this moving scene in the film Spartacus, when Kirk Douglas and someone else, was it Tony Curtis, I don't know, fighting and trying to kill each other. But it's because they love each other and they know the survivor will be cruelly put to death, so they're trying to kill the other for the sake of the other. Now, we've got something like this slightly going on here, because I'm claiming we may need Scanlon's version of contractualism because of these faults in Kant's, which seems to me the other best version. And Scanlon is defending Kant's version, and I'm attacking his defense because that will make his version more important. Okay, comments on those last remarks. He says, I agree with that point, though I don't find it surprising. Well, I agree that when we ask which kinds of principle Kant's contractualist formula would support, when combined with what Scanlon and I believe to be the right view about reasons, 'tisn't surprising that the formula supports ruled consequentialist conclusions. If some argument is both sound and pretty short, we shouldn't be surprised that when we consider this argument's premises that it's going to support its conclusions. If there's a surprise, it comes at an earlier stage. I think what may be surprising is that a consequentialist formula, which I believe is closer to Kant's own views than any other, and one that Kant came very close to suggesting, that, when combined with a view about rationality and reasons which isn't itself consequentialist, should nonetheless lead to rule consequentialist conclusions. That's what's surprising. As Rawls says, contractualism is the alternative. That's often its justification. Similar claims applies to Rawls's view. It isn't surprising. No, I'll leave that out. I'll go back to Kant and Scanlon. Well, how strong is the objection that appeals to these cases? Now, I think Scanlon's form of the objection seems overstated or misleadingly stated. He asks, can we impose on someone else any sacrifice that he or she wouldn't be crazy to make? Well, when I say that someone could rationally make some sacrifice, as when White could sacrifice her life to save the five, or you could sacrifice your life to save Black's life, I'm not claiming that if White and you made those choices, you wouldn't be being crazy. I'm claiming that those choices would be fully rational, since White and you would have sufficient reason to make them. Note next that by using the word sacrifice, that may be suggesting that these great burdens would be imposed as a means of benefiting others, as in the case of Bridge, in which we'd save the five by means of killing White. But we need also to consider lifeboat, tunnel, and earthquake. We impose a great burden on White if in lifeboat we save the five rather than White, and if in tunnel we redirect the train so that it kills White rather than the five. Now, Scanlon believes that we're morally permitted to kill White as a side effect of saving the five, and to save the five rather than White. And it counts in favor of this version of contractualism that it permits or requires those acts. If we turn to Bridge, this version of contractualism again permits us to impose this burden on White. And here we may find the formula unacceptable, because we'd be killing White as a means, not as a side effect. We may believe White has a right not to be killed as a means. Now, we might call that the deontological objection to this version of contractualism. And I think this is a very understandable opposition. On a contractualist view, which appeals to what we could rationally choose in some way that makes the results impartial, we shall obviously take into account benefits and burdens that different principle or acts would impose on people or give them, and some other things as well. But it's much less clear that we should take into account the facts to which the deontological constraints appeal, which are facts about the causal relations between benefits and burdens. Now, as I say, if White could rationally save the 5 by killing herself as a side effect, she has no reason to regard that as better than saving the 5 by killing herself as a means. So I think there is a very obvious tension between a contractualist view and deontological constraints. Now, I'd just say very briefly, if we ask what a contractualist formula would imply with respect to those two cases and other such cases, and also I think what Scanlon's contractualism implies, I think what it supports is the following double principle, which is that doctors must never kill their patients, either as a means or as a side effect of saving more people's lives. But in non-medical emergencies, with trains out of control or avalanches or fires or whatever, everyone should do whatever would save most lives. Now, it's easy to see why doctors should not be permitted to kill their patients. And that doesn't draw mean side effect. Just as much reason to exclude that. Well, deontological objections are not Scanlon's main concern. He's more concerned with distributive objections, the single person who'd bear the great burden. I just end with a comment about his own proposals. He says the idea of contractualism is that we should ask whether the claims of the few who will be harmed negatively are adequately answered by citing those of the many. By claims here, Scanlon means moral claims. Alan Wood protested yesterday against appealing to the distinction between the rational and the reasonable. Well, I accept Wood's objection to Rawls's use of this distinction, but reasonable can be used in a specifically moral sense, and that's what I take Scanlon to be doing. And a choice might fail to be rational without being unreasonable, and vice versa. I think they're different. A choice is unreasonable in the moral sense if the chooser is not giving enough weight or the right kind of weight to other people's well-being or moral claims. Now, in the cases that we're now concerned with, great burdens on a few people for the sake of benefits to others, the objection wouldn't be that you aren't giving enough weight to their well-being. You might be giving just as much weight as to everyone else's. It's that you're not giving enough weight to their claim not to have this great burden imposed on them. And that brings me to what I take to be the most important difference between Scanlonian contractualism and the neo-Kantian contractualism that I've been describing. Combines Kant's formula with an un-Kantian view on reasons. Since the neo-Kantian version appeals to claims about what everyone could rationally will or choose on non-moral grounds, it's more ambitious than Scanlon's version. Since Scanlon appeals to what's reasonable in the moral sense, the premises of his arguments, as he says, are somewhat closer to their conclusions, and more must be said to show how this version of contractualism isn't circular or trivial. Scanlonian moral reasoning sometimes allows us to appeal to our moral intuitions. We may be able to support and explain conclusions about which acts are wrong in an illuminating and non-circular way. But that distinction isn't as sharp, however, since there are borderline cases. And I think it may be least sharp in the kind of cases we're now considering, those in which, by imposing great burdens on a few, we could give small benefits to many others. And these are the cases that may count most strongly against the Kantian and in favor of Scanlon. And that could be expressed as follows. Even if the few could rationally will that everyone accept the principle that permitted such burdens to be imposed on them, our acceptance of this principle and our rejection of a principle that protects them from that might be unreasonable in the moral sense, because we'd be giving too little weight to their moral claims not to be treated like that. Now, that may seem too close to arguing that we're being unreasonable because it would be wrong to impose these burdens on the few. It would be pointless to say that people have moral claims to be treated in some way if and because such treatment is required by some unrejectable principle. if we also say that this principle is unrejectable because these people have moral claims not to be treated in that way? Well, I think the circularity objection isn't decisive. I think the most that it might show is that when we consider certain cases, Scanlon's contractualist formula isn't really doing independent work, since it's allowing us to appeal in this somewhat indirect way to our intuitions about the wrongness of acts. There may be many other kinds of case, however, and many other questions to which that objection doesn't apply. In these other cases, I think the formula does independent work, helping to explain and justify our beliefs and providing arguments against others. But that's a subject for another day.
Candidate for that. Because one thing that should be striking about Kant's presentation of the formulas is that he presents the formula of autonomy often in something like the form, act on those maxims that could make themselves or that you rationally will to be laws, right? Universal laws. And that's a much stronger requirement than you get in the formula of universal law, where all you are asking is whether it's conceivable, considering only grounds of thinkability and conflicting volitions, right? So what we really seem to want out of Kant is some kind of criterion. Well, which maxims are they that make themselves into universal laws? And I think that Kant's contractual formula, as you present it, is an interesting candidate for such a criterion. I'm not as deterred as Scanlon is, or maybe even as you are, by the thought that Kant doesn't accept your view about impartial reason giving senses of good, since the way I read what Kant says has to say about rational beings as ends in themselves, and about our own perfection and the happiness of others as ends that at the same time duties, I don't think he's at all distant from your view that there are these partial reason-giving goods. But there are really three considerations in Kant that make me not sure whether Kant's contractual formula, as you presented, is a reasonable version of the formula of humanity, or the formula of autonomy. And let me try briefly just to say what I think those are. First, Kant's theory of ethics in the broad sense, Sitten, is divided into two parts, right and ethics, Ethik, right? And there's a controversy among Kant people how you understand this. That is the formula of autonomy or formula of universal law, or whatever you take the universal formula of the moral law, does it govern both realms, or does it govern only ethics and the principle of right, which is that an action is right if it or its maxim can be is consistent with everyone's external freedom according to universal law, right? Is that a separate and distinct principle governing the area of right? I'm of the view that it's a separate and distinct principle. All right, suppose I'm right about that. Kant also holds that among the duties belonging to ethics is the duty to respect right. All right, so, and right provides what look to me like very non-consequentialist constraints on what your duties are. So that would be one source of worry about whether a contractualist, whether Kant's view could be contractualist or consequentialist, rather, in the way you're trying to develop it. A second worry I have is that when Kant turns to ethics, that is the ethics part, he doesn't seem to be a consequentialist, but he does seem to be a teleologist. That is, all the reasoning about what your duties are, whether they're strict duties or wide duties, is based on this idea that we have these duties of virtue, our own perfection and the happiness of others. But his way of thinking about these things isn't consequentialist, I don't think, and it's certainly deliberately eschews certain kinds of principles that, you know, what would go best on the whole and so on, that kind of thinking, because the idea is it's up to me to choose which bits of my perfection and the happiness of others I make my end. I'm not responsible in any way to choosing the maximum.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter whether, as a result of my setting those ends, anything like the maximum happens. And I don't get more merit for pursuing more of your good. I get more merit for sacrificing more of my good to pursue your good, or for putting forth more effort or something like that. But I don't get more merit for pursuing more of your good. So that's another sort of general area in which there's more I could say about that, but maybe I should move on. The other thing is the relation of the formula of autonomy to the formula of the realm of ends. And there, the way I read the formula of the realm of ends, I am unsure. You don't mention a certain factor that comes in very strongly in the realm of ends that perhaps you could mention, and that is the formula of the realm of ends, in effect, tells us to unify our ends with the ends of other people. It isn't focused solely on how to balance conflicting ends. It might say, in your terms, that it's something impartially good, that people modify their ends in such a way that their ends coincide. And in fact, Kant thinks there are two kinds of social relations that we have an ethical, not a juridical duty to enter into. One is friendship, and the other is what he calls the ethical community, and he means by that something like the church. And in both cases, what is decisive about those relations is the way in which they lead to one term he uses when he's talking about friendship is the swallowing up of your ends in a collective end. Right? Kant is very communitarian or communist or however you want to say about this. That is, he thinks that the formula of the realm of ends involves ultimately your not holding to your own good as an end all by itself. You ought to choose ends in such a way. So the laws that would follow a realm of ends would involve something like trying to make people's ends converge and be swallowed up into a larger end. Right. And
Alan, maybe you might have
I'm finished. I'm finished. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
No, that's very helpful and relevant. I mean, of course, I know Kant wasn't a consequentialist, and I'm very much thinking only of the Kant of the groundwork, because most of the formulas that I'm talking about don't recur in the Metaphysics of Morals. Really, all that I'm claiming is that the formula, as I interpret it, is very close to Kant, and I think it involves really only two steps. One is the move that in the formula of universal law, could I rationally will that it be universal? On one version, could I will that everyone accept the maxim or that everyone act on it? But I think it's clear in Kant, there's also, could I rationally will that everyone believe that to be permissible? I've got at least 5 quotations in which he said, no. Could I will that everyone believe it to be permissible? That can be restated as, could I will that everyone accepts a principle permitting it? And I think he assumes that everyone would reach the same answer to that. And I'd say, well, actually, that's not so, because of the impartiality objection. They wouldn't all reach the same answer. But then I'm saying, but if you have the right assumptions about rationality and reasons, you can get the intersection, because there are some principles that everyone could rationally choose. But my only point is the formula itself, and why I think the reference to the realm of ends is relevant, is that that introduces the idea of every rational being legislating the moral law. And it may be misleading to call it Kant's contractualist formula, because, of course, it's worlds away from contractualism as ordinarily conceived. in which there's debate and mutual interchange and threats and warnings and, you know, calculations to reach agreement. Worlds away from that. It's just the ones that each rational being could will to be universal. Now, are there some principles which is true? That's really all that I'm claiming. So, I mean, if you think that is a reading of those elements in Kant, that's really all I'm claiming. Now, what makes Kant so great, greatest moral philosopher, is that he's so enormously thought-provoking and stimulating. That's what my drab hero Sidgwick said about Kant, that he found him so enormously thought-provoking and stimulating. I think Sidgwick missed a lot in Kant. Sidgwick very badly misunderstands Kant's categorical formula. He takes it just to be, if an act is right for me, it must be right for anyone else in similar circumstances. That's a big misunderstanding. So what I'm doing, I'm just drawing on one of the elements of Kant, but I'm sure it's there.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one short question someone has. Jay?
Yeah, a short question about the discussion of Rawls's version of the
Yes, I'm sorry, that seemed a bit dismissive as I read it. But,
well, you know, I mean, I've always, as many people, have always been puzzled about this exclusion in Rawls's original position of information about, you know, the probability that you'd occupy each of the positions in the world that you're choosing principles for. But let me have a very, no doubt, inadequate stab at trying to defend exclusion of that kind of information from the Rawlsian choice situation.
well, it's not so much information, it's why it's objectionable to tell everyone to suppose that they have an equal chance.
Right.
Yeah, what's wrong with that version? That's the idea.
Right, yeah. Okay, the idea would be there are situations where your chances of occupying each of the positions that, you know, outcome positions that you're choosing, that your choice will determine is that's important information to take into account. It's crucial to the rationality of your decision and such. You're in the game show, you've won $20,000, there's a car behind door number 5, you know, and you're trying to decide whether to, you know, to bet this, or there's a car behind one of these doors, and you're trying to decide whether to, you know, to bet the money on the chance that the door you pick will have the car behind it and such. But in the kind of situation that Rawls is imagining, you're choosing principles to govern the whole of your life, which could radically affect your life prospects, right? And the idea might be that under those kinds of situations, the assumption that you're going to have an equal chance of occupying each of the possible positions will, in some sense, downplay or be the wrong response to the significance of the badness of certain potential outcomes.
I agree. I mean, following Nagel and Tim, reducing the question whether it's justified to impose these great burdens on a few people to whether it would have been rational for them in self-interested terms to choose principles that might permit that, it's just not the right way to do it. And the objection to telling them they have an equal chance is that then they're not going to take sufficiently seriously what happens to the people on whom these burdens are imposed. And as many people have said, Rawls's rejection of the equal chance really is that it's leading to the wrong conclusion. But I don't think that affects my claim that means that his appeal to veil of ignorance conclusion can't support his non-utilitarian conclusions, because his only reason for rejecting the version of it that supports utilitarianism is that it leads to the wrong conclusions. So,
well, that seems potentially just a little bit too quick. It might not be, the objection might not be simply that this is it would be the wrong outcome that would be, or the wrong set of principles that would be selected on the assumption of, equal probability. But somehow that the decision procedure has to be designed in a way that that expresses in some sense the significance of the difference between individual lives in some way.
Yes, and this isn't the way to do it. That isn't the way to do it. Yeah, I agree. Okay. I mean, but as I was partly pointing out, there are other objections. One is that, as Rawls himself admits, his argument doesn't support an acceptable distributive principle in morality. That's what he says.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But then, most of all, I think it excludes all non-utilitarian considerations, because it's just what would best promote their own self-interest.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but we have tomorrow's seminar, at which there'll be more opportunity for discussion. In the meantime, please thank Derek Parfit and all the commentators today.